Hello, and welcome to our discussion of religion in British North American society. We're going to cover a lot of ground very quickly, and I just want to give you a big picture overview of some crucial distinctions. And some of this will be absolutely basic for some of you, and for some of it may be entirely new. So it will become, as I proceed, more complex. So if you think, oh my God, I know all this at the beginning of this, hopefully by the end you won't know it all. But certainly at the beginning we'll cover some really basic ground. This is a Methodist camp meeting. This is in the United States. This is in New York State. It's about 1805, 1810. It's an American image, and therefore why are we looking at it? Part of it is because we don't have any comparable Canadian image to look at. But part of it too is because the Methodist ministers of the day, they were called circuit riders, and they traveled, as this name suggests, a circuit around their territory. They didn't have like a fixed congregation. They traveled from place to place. And many of them traveled throughout New York State and into Massachusetts and into Upper Canada, and in some instances Lower Canada as well. So a couple of the people that we'll see today, some of the Methodists in Canada, are in fact Americans who are part of the circuit. And of course that distinction, well, for many of us would be very, very important. For these people was less important. Certainly wasn't driving their agenda, that's for sure. The religious dimension of their circuits were much more important. But what I want you to see here is the informality of it. These are camp meetings. And some churches, some evangelical churches continue the tradition of having camp meetings today. And it's meant to kind of bring people together in a kind of celebratory fashion, but it's also to strip away a lot of the ornamentation and what many evangelicals regarded as distractions of the large institutional, particularly the kind of cathedral-like larger churches of the established churches, and to get people to focus on the Word of God rather than kind of the structures of the church. And that might be slightly unfair to Catholics and Anglicans, but certainly that was the way the evangelicals of the time, and probably of today, regarded that. Today we're going to cover really basic terrain, as I said. We're going to take a quick look at the Roman Catholic Church, which is largely, of course, in Quebec, in Lower Canada, and obviously earlier in New France. We'll look at the Church of England, the other established church, and we'll make a distinction here today between the evangelical or dissenting churches and the established churches. So we'll treat the Catholics and the Anglicans. They're not the same by any stretch of the imagination, but both of them are state supported churches and therefore kind of built into the structures of power in the society. And then we'll look separately at the dissenting evangelical Protestants, the New Lights, the Methodists, the Baptists, Presbyterians. Well, we'll see the Presbyterians are kind of crossed the line there, but some Presbyterians fit in this camp and some of them fit in the older camp. But we'll see that in a second. And then we'll talk. Really what I want to emphasize most in this is kind of the politics of belief, and really a quick emphasis on the important role of the Protestant Church in Upper Canada and Nova Scotia, obviously less so in Quebec, but kind of how that politics drives some important social and political stories of the 19th century. We'll pick up that in a few minutes. So we're going to begin in New France, so before the conquest, and I just want to show you this. This is one of these little corner pieces from maps that I've shown you a couple of in this course. This is from a 1733 map, and you can see the buildings, the key buildings, are all identified there for you with the letters, and there's a key above my head there that shows you what they all are. And so these are the major institutions of the city of Quebec in 1733. And what you'll see is that some of them are state buildings, some of them are state institutional buildings, but most of them are church buildings, hospital, churches, seminaries. These are the buildings that really dominate Quebec. And that really is a key feature of New France. The church plays a very important role in the organization of basic social institutions, but also therefore of politics. So there's a very, very close relationship between the state and the church here. And usually that's a relatively smooth relationship, although not always. Certainly there are frictions, to be sure. One of the things we see often in terms of disputes between the church and the state in Quebec in this time period relates to the fur trade, and the church is very unhappy about the way the church, sorry, the way the state encourages the fur trade, and in particular encourages the consumption of alcohol as a trade good in the fur trade. So what they see is a deliberate attempt to, what the church sees is a deliberate attempt to give them a kind of easy product, but a product, of course, that also has social risks attached to it. And for people who have no experience with alcohol, these social risks can be quite enormous. So you certainly see social problems emerging in some indigenous communities fairly early in the late 17th and early 18th century. And the church actively resisting this, recognizing that this is a wrong action and trying to change that. It's a good example of a distinction between the two. I think oftentimes people tend to kind of just lump them in together. And often that's true, but not always. The Catholic Church did not provide, still does not provide, significant roles for women. Only men can become priests, and therefore only men can play a role in the higher hierarchy, the bishopry and the cardinals and the pope and so on. But there is a significant tradition of women playing an important role as nuns, as sisters of Christ in the church tradition. And because there's so many weak institutions in New France, it provides a kind of opportunity for a number of women in the 17th and 18th centuries. Women who can find a role, sharp, intelligent, organized women who are able to organize monasteries and schools and other orders of nuns. You see Marguerite de Youville is the founder of the Sisters of Charity, an order that still exists in Montreal. Ursuline Convent, Ursuline Monastery in Quebec. And so these women come to play fairly significant roles in the politics of the day. They're fairly powerful. Certainly not like the governor, certainly not like the intendant, but they're fairly powerful, and they certainly can be influential in New France society. And certainly they're very good at providing roles for women and providing services for women that the rest of New France society wasn't doing. After the conquest, the Catholic Church found itself in a slightly difficult position. We saw the Quebec Act protected the Catholic Church, and that was clearly a strategic move on the part of the British because they wanted to have the cooperation of the church. They knew that if they had the cooperation of the Catholic Church, they would have the cooperation of a major political actor in New France, what is now Lower Canada. And it worked. It meant that the Catholic Church was always slightly beholden to the British state. So they were never going to be hostile critics of the British. Certainly sometimes they were critics, there's no doubt about that. But they would never fundamentally challenge the place of the British in New France society or in Lower Canadian society. So certainly the British, in the same way that the French had used the church as a kind of institution, in some ways of social control, but also of just kind of social regulation, of kind of maintaining order in the society. The British did very much the same thing. They saw the Catholic Church as an effective tool for that purpose. Looking at, here this is a photograph taken of Montreal in 1851, one of the earliest photographs of Montreal we have. And you see the arrows. I'm just trying to show you the presence of the church in Montreal. Montreal at this time is much smaller than it is today. But if you know Montreal at all today, you're kind of sitting in the old city here, looking towards the mountain. In fact, that big cathedral on your right, on my left, if that weren't there and it was today, you could probably see McGill University in the background against the foot of the hill over there, foot of the mountain over there. So it can give you some sense of what you're looking at. I just want you to see those four big churches. There's lots more churches. These are just the big ones. These are just the cathedrals, the ones that we can spot at a distance. And I think we could overplay the significance of that, but certainly in terms of a presence in Lower Canadian society, the Catholic Church is enormously powerful. They're going to run schools. They're going to run hospitals. They're going to run social services for families. They're going to run pretty much everything in Lower Canadian French Catholic society. They're a powerful, powerful social presence and will continue to be so well into the 20th century. It won't be until the Quiet Revolution of the 1960s and 1970s that will change significantly. But there are other established churches. And of course, with the shift to British rule, that means that the new major player is the Anglican Church, the Church of England. Anglicans are like the Catholic Church, a kind of state-supported church. They're the official Church of England. The Queen today, our Queen, is the head of the Church of England. There's an Archbishop of Canterbury, who heads the church officially, but technically at the very top of that, it's the Queen or the King, if it happens to be a king. He or she doesn't really run the church, but officially they're the head of that church, and so that shows that strong connection to the state. And in the 19th century and 18th century, for that matter, that connection was much stronger. So certainly the place of the Anglican Church in, to a lesser extent, Nova Scotia, but still very, very important, but particularly in Upper Canada is very, very important, particularly in that early period after the Loyalists, because while many of the Loyalists aren't Anglicans, we'll pick up that story in a few minutes, certainly the higher officials are, certainly the military officials and the political officials, most of them are. And that's a function in part of kind of who they are and where they came from. In other words, Anglicans tend to get appointed to these kinds of positions, but also a little bit of the other way around, of people moving towards Anglicanism because it was politically expedient to do so. How do I get ahead in this society? I convert to the Anglican Church, even if I'm a Methodist, even if I'm a Catholic. Actually, the Catholic's probably easier in terms of theology, but a bigger move politically. But certainly there's a sense that you ought to belong to the Anglican Church. And certainly major, not all by any stretch of the imagination, we'll meet some of these later, but certainly many significant merchants and political officials in Upper Canada, and as I say, to a lesser extent Nova Scotia, but still there as well. It's seen that one ought to, not that one must, but that one ought to belong to the Anglican Church. It would certainly lend political advantages to belong to the Anglican Church. So in many ways, many of the leading figures of Upper Canadian society are Anglicans, and some of them are in fact priests and bishops in the Anglican Church. And so again, you see that close connection between the state and politics, the church and politics in Upper Canadian society. This also means that London, in our world, in the British North American world, is the political center of English Christianity. So Rome, of course, is the center of Catholic Christianity, but London becomes the political center of English Christianity. And there's other dimensions of that we could certainly explore, but it means that London takes on a kind of not just a political significance, but also a kind of spiritual significance as well. And there's also a more, I guess, ideological dimension to all of that. Like the Catholic Church, the Anglicans have a strong belief in an ordered, hierarchical, and therefore naturally unequal society. In other words, that people who are rich and people who are poor are playing a part in God's role, God's plan for how the world ought to be. People who are born into privileged positions do so because God deemed it that way. It was part of the natural order. And the poor are poor because, well, that's the part of the natural order. It means that kind of thinking is common in Upper Canadian political thinking in the late 18th and early 19th century. And that's really, really important. So in our last screencast, we were talking about the Loyalists and this issue of loyalty being a kind of test for participation in politics in this time period. But also this notion that republicanism or democracy was somehow suspicious because it was American. This feeds into this as well. So it means that both the church and politics are both kind of feeding into this notion that the world is naturally unequal. And so therefore calls for democracy are viewed suspiciously. Now again, I have to be really cautious here and not make you think that England is a fascist society or a completely authoritarian society or not. It's not. It is fundamentally a democratic society in many, many ways, but it's a very limited one. Very few people actually, while there's a parliament, while there's elected government, very few people actually have the vote. And so when we talk about democratization, what we're talking about is bringing more people in to have the vote, more people, poorer people, bringing them into the church. Certainly African Americans, women, all these kinds of people who don't play a role in formal politics. When those calls for democratization, that kind of democratization takes place, certainly the Anglican Church resists that as firmly as it possibly can. The other church I need to mention here, because we have a lot of Scottish people immigrating into British North America, is the Church of Scotland. This is a little more complicated because the Church of Scotland, like the Church of England, is a state church. It's the official Church of Scotland, and therefore has those kinds of political connections as well. And while there's an evangelical wing of the Anglican Church, it's not a particularly powerful one. The evangelical wing of the Presbyterian Church, on the other hand, is very powerful. So powerful that the Presbyterian Church splits 3 times, once in the 18th century and twice in the 19th century, over basic issues of church governance. And it's a battle between these kind of older established church people who believe in this kind of ordered hierarchical view and the dissenting evangelicals who believe in a more bottom-up, therefore more democratic form of church governance. And of course, that's going to spill over into ordinary politics, secular politics as well. Speaking of this kind of ordered hierarchical view, just a couple of quick quotes to give you a sense of what that means. This is a Church of Scotland Presbyterian minister in Halifax writing from a sermon in the 1790s. And he says, "In society, inequality is just as natural as in the forest." We have that natural dimension of inequality, but productive of much more salutary effects. Inequality is good. Without inequality, what would become of the necessary distinctions of parent and child, master and scholar, employer and employee? And so what they're arguing is that inequality is kind of natural within nature, but also natural within kind of relations within our society, family relations, employment relations, and so on. So inequality in this view becomes something that you must protect because it actually serves a very important role in an effectively run society. And just another quote. So he was Presbyterian. This is Bishop John Strawn, who's Bishop of Upper Canada. Listen to this. "Subordination in the moral world is manifest, and this appearance of nature indicates the intention of its author." So subordination, where one is subordinate to another in the moral world, where one understands moral dimensions and political dimensions very clearly, and others don't, and therefore need guidance. This is built into nature. This is part of God's natural, the intention of its author, God, and notice the capital A. This is God's plan, and it's written into nature. There's this kind of notion of a natural theology there, which shows how society should be governed. And so this will be very much part of, it's important for us to keep in mind, this is very much part of how they think about politics and democracy. Here's Bishop Strawn here on the left. Strawn's enormously influential. He's also influential as a teacher. He teaches the children of the elite. Don't think public schooling here. This is kind of private tutoring. He takes the children of the elite into his home for particular educations, and he teaches them that older conservative view. And as does actually Bishop Charles Inglis, the Bishop of Nova Scotia. Both of these people are people with loyalist backgrounds. Both of these people are Anglicans. Both of these people believe in this close connection between order, authority, church, and state, and believe that they play a key role in maintaining that kind of cohesive, coherent, ordered view of society, and of limiting the impact of democracy in British North American society. We then need to turn to the dissenting churches. Now, the dissenting churches is where we'll spend more of our time in the remainder of the course. And you'll see why, because they begin to play a much more important role, not just theologically, not just in terms of people attending those churches and kind of politics of belief, but the influence they will have on politics, the influence they will have on an emerging political culture in British North America. Here we're talking about mostly evangelical churches, the New Lights. The New Lights are kind of a not particularly sectarian group, but mostly Baptists and American Congregationalists. This is in Nova Scotia mostly in the 18th century, going into the 19th century. Then the Methodists, who are kind of a dissenting Anglican church. The Baptists, who are kind of autonomous but evangelical group, and then the dissenting Presbyterians, who I mentioned earlier. This is the evangelical branch of the Presbyterian Church. And in Scotland, they represent at least half, probably 2/3 of the Presbyterian membership in Scotland in this time period. And then in Nova Scotia, they would represent probably 75% of the Presbyterian population in Nova Scotia, and probably about 50-60% in Upper Canada. Slightly more conservative Church of Scotland in Upper Canada, largely because of the stronger association with the Anglican Church and that kind of hierarchical agreement that they have. There's also all kinds of other smaller churches that we could point to, many of which are quite important and at times play significant roles in the colony, but not nearly as much as these larger evangelical churches. So the Quakers and Moravians are kind of well-known examples, but there's certainly not large groups, and certainly not in this kind of class, the kind of group we can spend a whole lot of time on. There's a kind of evolving pattern here from the middle of the 18th century to the middle of the 19th century. One of the kind of big stories, much more so in Nova Scotia than in Upper Canada, although at the end of the story it begins to have an effect in Upper Canada as well, is the emergence of the Second Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening is an evangelical explosion in England in the early 18th century. But it takes off in North America as well in the 1760s, 1770s, and in British North America, in Nova Scotia and Upper Canada, it certainly lasts from about 1770 up to about 1800. These are radical evangelicals. These are people who are launching a very fundamental and radical critique of the established churches, and not even of the established churches, in many cases of the existing evangelical churches as well. And these people really emphasize a kind of spiritual rebirth, an emotional and direct, this is really key, an emotional and direct connection with God. And again, if for those of you who don't know anything about evangelicalism, certainly a crucial theological distinction there is that evangelicals believe that individual Christians must have a direct relationship with God, and that they learn and experience God by reading the Bible, whereas Catholics and Anglicans and Church of Scotland people believe in that kind of hierarchical view where moral authority is vested with an elite group, the trained priests and bishops and so on, who in a kind of hierarchical fashion, who make sure that the people below them correctly interpret gospel and so on. Whereas the evangelicals say, no, humans don't need that. Humans need to understand God directly themselves. Much more important for that to happen. So you see this explosion of evangelical thinking, particularly in Nova Scotia. And recall from our American Revolution Week, one of our excerpts from George Rollock and Gordon Stewart emphasized this very point, that this New Light Christian revival, the Second Great Awakening, was underway in Nova Scotia at the time. And they argue that this is part of the reason why Nova Scotia didn't join the American Revolution. So this is that story unfolding here. And there's a number of important figures. I've noted some of them here for you in the Nova Scotia Second Great Awakening story. This spreads into Upper Canada through this kind of circuit rider group. Some of these figures end up sometimes preaching. They travel a lot. Most of them end up in New England more than in Upper Canada, but some of them end up in Upper Canada as well. Where you see greater interaction between Americans, Nova Scotians, and Upper Canadians is among the Methodists. And there you see these particularly American, Massachusetts, New York-based Methodist preachers who travel from town to village to settlement, having these kinds of camp meetings. And they set up meetings rather than kind of Sunday afternoon, church going, where for several days whole communities will gather together and extol their place as Christians, and also to talk about the experience of Christianity and to experience a wholesale revival of their commitment to Christ. These are really interesting events. They, as I say, they can often last, well, certainly days, but often last weeks. And so they take people away from what many people consider to be their proper behavior. So, for example, the political officials in Upper Canada see these things going on, and what they see is people not tending to their farms, people not doing the kind of work that they're supposed to be doing. Whereas, of course, these people are arguing that the work on my soul is the much more important work. One of the most famous of these camp meetings takes place in Hay Bay in 1791. And this church is an outcome of that. It's a church that's built in 1792 in Napanee. And this is the first big camp revival meeting in Upper Canada. And Hay Bay and the Napanee area will remain an evangelical center in Upper Canada into the 20th century. In fact, probably still is today a center of evangelical Christianity in Upper Canada. And I want you to see, I mean, you might think this is just an old rundown building, and certainly it could use some paint, but it's not just run down. It's deliberately simple. This is a deliberate, this is part of the critique of the established churches, that they put far too much emphasis on ornamentation, far too much emphasis on aesthetics, and far too little emphasis on just having a place where people can gather to discuss Christ. And when they see that as far more important. This is a church very near us in Thorold in Beaver Dams. And this is a Methodist church as well. It's constructed about 30 years later. It's an older model. And you're going to see a video of me in our seminar setup. But what I want you to see here is just that, again, that kind of very plain outward design, completely lacking in ornamentation. Very, very simple building. And again, this is deliberate. This is not because they're cheap or poor or whatever. This is a deliberate effort. I have some photographs of the Beaver Dams Church, but it's in the middle of renovation, so it's kind of a mess. This is one from Grand Prairie. This is a Covenanter church. They're a form of Presbyterians, dissenting Presbyterians. And this interior gives you some sense of the aesthetic they're looking for. Look how austere this is. This is absolutely plain, absolutely simple. Not completely without ornament. The altar in the center has some ornamentation about it, but not much. And I think just those of you who are Catholic or Anglican will certainly be struck by how simple this is if you've attended Mass in a church. But I mean, just for kind of an obvious comparison, this is St. Mary's Basilica in Halifax, and I could have shown you any number of churches, but this is a Catholic cathedral. This is the seat of the Catholic Church in Nova Scotia. There's ornamentation here. This is all about the glory of God. This is about creating not just an institution for worship, but an institution to glorify God and to really inspire awe in people. But of course, what the evangelicals say is that that's a distraction, that the awe you want to feel for God can be found just in the Word of God in the Bible. So these are really different approaches to thinking about theology, thinking about faith. But also, of course, and again, we got to keep this in our mind, that it spills over into politics as well. So some of the people that we've been looking at, you'll see some of these people in our readings the next few weeks. Nathan Bangs, he's that Methodist circuit rider. You'll see some of his readings in our readings on sexuality. And you're also going to see some readings by Egerton Ryerson, and he'll show up again later when we look at education. He's the first commissioner of education in Upper Canada, very influential in the creation of the public education system. And I just want to highlight here for a moment the connection here, that this is not random. This is not just, they don't just happen to be evangelicals. There's part of their theology here. Ryerson, let's begin with evangelicals in general. Because evangelicals are concerned about ordinary people's relationship with God, that means that we're all the same. And that means that we are all deserving of God's graces, but we're also in a secular society deserving of the same kinds of support. So should education be made available to everybody in society? Well, evangelicals say yes. Anglicans and Catholics tend to say, no, we can just have a seminary, we can train priests, we can train lawyers, that kind of thing, but we don't need to train ordinary people. No, Egerton Ryerson and evangelicals there's some disagreement here, but tend to emphasize, no, everybody deserves that level of education. So part of the drive towards mass education stems from an increasingly important role played by evangelicals in Upper Canadian and Nova Scotian society for that matter as well. This extends to Indigenous people as well. Evangelicals embrace, Methodists in Upper Canada very much embrace the notion that missionary activity amongst Indigenous people is important, but what they see as being most important is finding Indigenous converts who will become missionaries themselves. And this is one of these men. His Christian name is John Sunday. His name is Shawunda. He's an Ojibwa man, Mississauga, and he's an important and significant Methodist missionary in the 19th century. And there's a number of people we can point to. Probably the most famous of these men is Peter Jones, and this is his English wife, Elizabeth Field, and she comes from an from an evangelical background in England. And again, what's remarkable here, and I don't want to, we can get easily romantic and utopian about this, but they do tend to treat people as individuals rather than as types. And so Elizabeth Field doesn't see Peter Jones as an indigenous man. She sees him as a good Christian, and that's kind of the basis for their relationship. But that kind of notion of seeing God's creatures rather than the kind of types that humans tend to apply in those fields really, really matters. And so it means that a woman like Elizabeth Field can herself become an important missionary. So it really empowers women to engage actively, not only in kind of domestic activities, but in public activities. And later we'll talk about kind of women in public-private roles. But this is a good example of a woman breaking out of that private domestic sphere and moving into a public sphere. And lots of women do it in the 19th century, and they're almost all evangelicals. This is Hannah Maria Norris, later marries, becomes Armstrong, who's a missionary to the Mi'kmaq in the 1860s and then moves to Thailand in 1870, where she'll stay for 40 years. And Catherine Sutton, who's an Ojibwe woman who is a missionary in Port Credit to the Ojibwe there, and also becomes an active defender of indigenous political rights and treaty rights. And so the education that these people have, the confidence that they gain in public speaking, the confidence that they have that they are working with God on their side, empowers them to tremendous degrees, and gives them the sense that they have a major contribution to make to society. And they do. They're active, engaged people. And much of this stems from that evangelical notion of, because I have this relation to God, I am free and I can act accordingly, so long as I'm acting in concert with God's wishes. So the political effects of all this is kind of a conclusion here. State church with tremendous political privileges. This is more true in Lower Canada with the Catholic Church, but it's certainly very true in Upper Canada, and to a lesser extent very true in Nova Scotia. The Anglican Church in Upper Canada, we've talked about the family compact. And the family compact is the glue that holds the family compact together is power, but much of that power comes from the church. Part of it comes from economics and political power, but part of it comes from religion and church power as well. And it's because of participation and engagement with the Anglican Church that part of that power comes to be. So being Anglican, particularly if you're an elite person, is very, very important. It gives you access to another dimension of power in British North American society. Of course, also creates sectarian divides. And some of these divides show up in all kinds of ways. The most obvious is a Protestant-Catholic divide. But as I've shown you, in many ways, well, certainly most Anglicans would probably publicly be fierce critics of the Catholic Church. Theologically, there's not a whole lot of difference between the two of them. There's much greater divides between the state churches and the evangelical churches than simply between Catholics and Protestants. But certainly, in general, in the 19th century, the Catholic-Protestant divide is enormous. And certainly because Anglicans can claim to be Protestants, even though that claim is theologically a bit suspect, they're still powerful, they're still influential. And it marks that sharp differentiation with Catholics, but also, of course, with the evangelical churches as well. That's going to change over the 19th century as more and more Presbyterians and Methodists become actively engaged in politics and move into influential roles in society. They'll take on more power. But certainly in the late 18th and early 19th century, those divides are very, very sharp, and the state churches have an enormous influence there. But we also see, as evangelicals become more influential, more powerful, a shifting emphasis to the role of individuals. And again, that's about that one-on-one relationship between God and the individual Christian, be that person a white male or a black female or an indigenous person or whatever. It's about the relationship that one of God's creatures has with God. And that's a really critical distinction that evangelicals allow. And it means that many, many more people are given to allow themselves to believe that they play an important role as an individual in society. And so that's going to change society. It means that these people will make demands on not only on the church, but on politics to play a greater role in political society. So this will apply to women, this will apply to the poor, it will apply to indigenous people, African Americans, and again, the connection to the abolition movement. Evangelicals play a very key role in the abolition movement. Many of you may know the hymn "Amazing Grace," probably one of the most famous songs certainly in church history, but maybe one of the most famous songs in the English language. That's an abolition. That's an evangelical hymn, but it's about abolition. It's written by John Newton in the 18th century, and it's his conversion story being told. But what really marks this is him seeing the evil of the slave trade, which he had been a supporter of before. And that's what the song's really all about. So there's a really, really close connection between evangelicals and the abolition movement. That's not part of this course for any length of time, but certainly in other courses might provide a good center for study. And fourth and finally, we can see a kind of clear shift towards a kind of egalitarianism. And that's where the state and the churches begin to realize that because all these individuals are equal, because they all have the same relationship with God, so long as they're good Christians, that is, they deserve to be treated equally. And so an egalitarian ideal can come out of that. But that's going to show up in all kinds of other ways as well, in thinking about how the state needs to deal with people. And education policy is by far the best example of that, that we need to think about training people, educating people so that they can read the Bible, so they can actually interact with the rest of the world as clearly and effectively and as intelligently as possible, that they will have the ability to govern their own lives as effectively as possible, because as good Christians, that's exactly what God would want.